She believed that this was what love was, the sweet words at the end of the workday, the silent glances when no one was looking, the gifts left unmarked on the pillow. He said he couldn't admit it, that his world was too complicated to fit her in. And she, alone in the cramped little room at the back of the mansion, accepted everything without demanding anything. Until one night, without wanting to, she heard what she should never have heard, the same voice that made her dream, calling another, "Woman, my love," with the same tone he used with her. It was as if the ground broke beneath her feet. The truth didn't come with screams or fights, it came with silence. And in the silence, she felt that everything she had lived had been just a role, a rehearsal, for the final humiliation. She didn't scream, she didn't break anything, she didn't beg for explanations. She just smiled with teary eyes as she closed the door to her little room that night, as if she were also closing a cycle of illusions. The millionaire, accustomed to being idolized and forgiven, didn't notice anything different, not at that moment. But what he didn't know was that he would lose everything he pretended not to value. Because karma doesn't come with a warning. It comes at just the right time, dressed in the clothes of contempt that it once offered itself. And when fate decided to balance the accounts, it didn't use revenge or scandal. It used silence. And her silence was crueler than any scream. If you feel that this story has something to say to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and come with us. Because what is to come may speak directly to your heart. June always thought that love would come like in the movies. An unexpected look, a caring gesture, a word spoken with tenderness in the midst of chaos. But when life gives you no choice, you start to see affection where there is only habit. She was not innocent, but she also did not know how cruel the world could be to those who feel too much and expect too much from someone who does not know what love is. Working as a maid since she was 18, June learned early on to be quiet, clean, invisible corners and smile when everything hurt inside. At 25, she lived in the back of the Grayson mansion in a small room with thin walls and windows that only looked out onto the wall. But there was something about that place that made everything bearable. His presence. Thomas Grayson, owner of one of the largest real estate development networks in Florida, father of 2 teenage children, and married to a woman who barely showed up at home, Thomas was a man who exuded control and charm, a type of charm that didn't scream, that only imposed itself with a contained smile and a look that seemed to say everything without saying anything. June watched him from afar, at first with respect, then with enchantment, and finally with a feeling she tried to deny. But that grew every day when he came into the kitchen, late at night just to ask if there was any dessert left. He always seemed too tired to go to the fridge, but never too tired to stay 5 more minutes with her. And it was in those 5 minutes that she built what he never imagined, hope. When he complimented her seasoning, she smiled at the stove as if listening to a declaration. When he left quick notes on Post-its, she kept them as if they were letters. When he left chocolates on the kitchen counter, she pretended not to know who they were from, but her heart beat as if she had received flowers. It was a silent romance built in the solitude of small gestures. He never promised anything, but he never said no either. And that, for her, was everything. Sometimes she would catch herself looking at their reflection in the glass kitchen door. He was sitting, she was standing, both of them laughing at something silly. It was a portrait she painted with her eyes and then kept in her memory as if it were real. He didn't have a ring on his finger, even though he was married, and he never talked about his wife. That to June was a sign that something in him was broken too, and she believed, perhaps too strongly, that that was where love was born, in the broken part of people. And so, day after day, June would sink into a feeling that she didn't know if was reciprocated, but that made her heart beat faster. And sometimes that was enough to keep her living in the silence of the little room, dreaming of a future that only existed in her imagination. In the Grayson mansion, time seemed to have its own rhythm. Inside, footsteps were measured, conversations were short, and smiles were always too polite to be sincere. It was a place where everyone knew their role and tried hard not to cross the invisible line between employer and employee. But between Thomas and June, that line began to unravel little by little, like a loose seam that gives way without fanfare. He was never as kind to the other employees in the house as he was to her. He always called her by her name while the others were just functions, driver, cook, gardener. But she was June, and sometimes Junie, said with a slight smile on the corner of his lips. A nickname that only he used, and that made her stomach turn every time she heard it. It wasn't explicit, it wasn't blatant, it was subtle, and for that reason, all the more dangerous. It started with him complimenting the cake she made on Sundays, then asking her to make breakfast, even when it wasn't his turn, just because he liked the way she made the eggs. June, who had never been noticed anywhere, started to feel special, and when you feel special, the whole world changes color. He only had to get close to her, and she forgot she was just the cleaning lady. She felt like a woman, she felt like someone. Thomas's gaze didn't say much, but it didn't go away either. He watched her as if testing the effect of her presence, as if he knew he was being admired. And even when the rest of the house whispered, she kept quiet. She didn't want to ruin what she was building inside herself, the illusion that he was different with her for a real reason. On one of her birthdays, which no one in the house knew about, Thomas came into the kitchen late at night with a discreet bag. He said it was a gift he had seen, and thought was just like her. A hardcover, flowery notebook with a gold pen. For you to write down your recipes, or your dreams, he said, looking into her eyes. For longer than necessary. June almost couldn't thank him. This was unusual, this was a sign. That night she cried silently into her pillow, feeling for the first time that someone saw her beyond the role she occupied. She began to sleep with the notebook next to her bed, even without writing anything on the pages. For her, the simple fact of existing was enough. He had given something just for her. And that, in her affection-starved mind, was the equivalent of a promise. Deep down, June knew that men like Thomas didn't belong with women like her. But she also knew that sometimes, no matter how unlikely it may seem, fate likes to play with possibilities. So she lived in that in-between place, between reality and what could be. Every smile, every look, every kind word was treasured with an almost sacred care. And even though she had never heard the word love come out of his mouth, she believed she felt it. And when we believe in something too strongly, it starts to seem real, even if only to ourselves. The silence that surrounded June's footsteps through the mansion's hallways now seemed to have another sound, a sound that only she could hear. It was expectation. Every time Thomas passed by her, even if it was quickly, her heart tightened as if waiting for a sign, a gesture, anything that would confirm what she so wanted to believe. And then the gifts came, discreet, without notes, but left in places where only she would find them. A blue scarf on the bed, the exact perfume. She once said she dreamed of having a porcelain mug engraved with the letter J that mysteriously appeared on the kitchen shelf. Thomas never admitted to having left it, but he smiled at the corner of his mouth when she commented in a low voice, as if she knew exactly what it was about. It was the kind of game that sets your soul on fire, because you can't complain about anything, but you also can't help but feel everything. She began to keep each object as if they were pieces of a puzzle. That little by little were proof that there was something there, something that only the two of them understood. At the bottom of the closet drawer, there was a cardboard box where she put everything she believed came from him. It was a collection of hope. The way he treated her in front of the children, always with respect, calling her the most efficient girl in the house. The way he preferred the dishes she prepared even when there were chefs hired for fancy dinners. She interpreted all of this as signs of a silent feeling. But what hurts in a one-sided passion is that we interpret the other person's silence as an answer, and forget that sometimes silence is just silence. One afternoon, while cleaning his office, she found a scribbled sheet of paper forgotten on his desk. On it was a list of guests for a business trip, and there, in the corner of the page, was a woman's name underlined with a heart drawn next to it. June didn't know who it was, but she felt a bitter taste in her throat. He took a deep breath, folded the paper back up and left it where it was, but that small mark was already a crack in the mirror she had been polishing for months. Still, she tried to convince herself that it could just be a silly, unimportant gesture. She preferred to feed the image she had built, because deconstructing it hurt more than swallowing the doubt. That same week, Thomas asked her to host a small dinner in the backyard. He wanted something special, but intimate. He said he would invite people who really mattered. June spent the whole day preparing the details. She bought flowers out of her own pocket. She lit candles. She chose the best china in the house. Deep down, she hoped that this evening would mark a new beginning. But as night fell and she lurked behind the pantry curtain, she watched Thomas greet an elegant blonde woman, whom he called Honey, in the same soft tone she thought was hers alone. June's heart didn't break with a bang. It broke silently, with the cruel gentleness of someone who understands once and for all that she was alone in the story she had invented. That night, June didn't cry. She sat in the dark of the maid's room, hugging her legs, feeling the weight of a truth that deep down had always been there. The woman in the garden wasn't Thomas's wife, nor his daughter, nor his relative. She was someone from the outside, and at the same time, from the inside, someone who received the same "my love" that she had heard days ago. In the hallway, when Thomas, with his gentle gaze and low voice, had called her not to forget to have dinner, that was how he acted. He enveloped her with small gestures, as if lighting candles in hearts that only needed warmth. And she, alone, burned completely. For hours, she stayed still in bed, listening to the muffled laughter coming from the garden in the distance, as if each laugh was a blow to her hopes. But she didn't leave. She didn't confront him. She didn't ask for explanations. Because there were no explanations to ask for when everything was built on one side only. The next morning she got up as she always did. She made coffee, straightened the cushions, washed the dishes. No trace of pain was visible on her face. But inside, every gesture was a wound being repeated. Thomas appeared in the kitchen mid-morning, smiling as if nothing had happened. He complimented the aroma of the coffee. He tried to make conversation, and June responded kindly, but her eyes no longer sparkled. He could tell. He hesitated for a moment, as if he had noticed something was different about her, but then he looked away and left. Men like Thomas could sense when something was out of control, but they rarely cared enough to change the course of things. She went back to her room after work and for the first time took out the flowery notebook he had given her and began to write. Not a diary, but a farewell. Words that only she would read. Words that would help her empty her chest of what would never be returned. In the days that followed, June acted calmly. She didn't pull away abruptly. She didn't show anger. She just seemed more distant. Thomas tried to resume their silent games. He left another new mug on the kitchen shelf, but she didn't touch it. She didn't look. The old June would have hugged the mug as a sign of reconciliation. The new June walked right past, as if the porcelain no longer held anything. And in that moment, he understood that he had lost something. He didn't know what, but he had. She was still there, but what had existed inside her was no longer available. It was like loving a photograph. You see the image, but you don't feel the warmth. One rainy night, Thomas arrived wet, without an umbrella, complaining about the sudden storm. She offered him a towel as she always did. He took it, held her hand for a second, as if asking for something without words. And she, with a brief smile, slowly pulled her own hand away. She simply said, "It's okay, Mr. Grayson." It was the first time she had called him that, after months of treating him with tenderness in her eyes. That formality chilled the air between them, and he, perhaps for the first time, felt the weight of the name he carried. Because anyone who is called Sir by someone who has already called him Thomas knows that they have lost more than intimacy. They have lost presence. The weeks that followed were strangely normal. The silence between them was not one of war, but of emptiness. Thomas continued his routine as if nothing had happened, as if the space between them was still filled with that sweet and ambiguous tension from before. But for June, Everything was now too clear to be confused with sweetness. She saw his gestures as what they had always been, control mechanisms, little tricks of a man accustomed to charming without commitment, to conquering without consequence. But even so, there were days when her heart wavered. Because forgetting someone who was never yours, but who occupied all your thoughts is a violent task. And she bled in silence with a practiced smile while cleaning the same floor that she had once walked barefoot on, thinking it was part of the house. The most painful thing was realizing that Thomas didn't miss the old June. He only missed what she represented, the attention that demanded nothing in return, the silent admiration, the discreet affection of someone who knew the exact moment to serve tea or look away to preserve his dignity. Now without that, he seemed slightly disconcerted. He was more harsh with the other employees. He was more absent in conversations with his children. Sometimes he would linger in the hallway where her room was, as if he expected to see her passing by. But she no longer passed by at that time. She silently adjusted her routine so as not to cross paths with him. Avoiding her gaze was easier than avoiding the past he carried in his chest. One Sunday morning, as she was pruning the plants in the side garden, Thomas came over. He asked her how she was. He said he had been worried that she seemed distant. She looked at him and said, "I'm fine, Mr. Grayson. Sometimes you just need to reorganize your feelings." Her answer took him by surprise. There was no accusation there, no open hurt, just maturity. Just a mirror in which he could, for the first time, see himself completely. And he didn't like what he saw. But as always, he looked away, and walked away without another word. June began using the notebook to jot down recipes, yes, but also to write phrases she wanted to repeat to herself on the days when the memory of him was pressing. You weren't the problem. You're worth more than silence. You deserve to be chosen. That became her bedtime ritual. Each page filled was a step out of the emotional captivity she had lived in for so long. She still slept in the same room. She still earned the same salary. She still wore the same uniform. But inside, something had already changed, and Thomas felt it. He missed the woman who looked at him as if he were more than he was. And now, without that reflection, he began to notice the emptiness of his own image. The final end began with a sound that June knew well, but she had not expected to hear it this way. It was Thomas's voice muffled behind the half-open door of the living room. He was talking on the phone, laughing softly, with that intimate tone that she had so often found. Exclusive, but this time it was not to her. "You know you're the only one, my dear," he said and laughed again. "The other one is just part of the house, like the furniture. You know how it is." June stood still, holding the silver tray in her hands, balancing 2 cups of tea. That sentence was not just a cut, it was the final sentence. Not only did he not love her, but he had never seen her. Never. She was part of the furniture, invisible, silent, useful, and replaceable. For a second she felt the ground move away from under her feet. Her throat went dry, her eyes burned, but she did not let the tray shake. She simply turned and walked back to the kitchen, her steps firm, as if she had heard nothing. But inside, it was like everything had fallen apart. That night she didn't sleep. She tidied up the drawers, folded her clothes, throwed away the mug with the letter J on it. She tore out the pages of the notebook where he had been mentioned. But she didn't cry. She was past the crying stage. She was entering a place where pain turns into action. The next day she woke up earlier than usual. She made coffee for everyone. She cleaned every corner of the house more thoroughly than ever. She left the place spotless. And at the end of the day she went to his office. She knocked twice. He answered, surprised. She came in with a white envelope in her hands. "My letter of resignation. I want to leave at the end of the month." He frowned, confused. "Are you unhappy?" "Did I do something wrong?" She smiled calmly. "No. I just want to go. It's time." He tried to hide his uneasiness. "We can talk about it." But she had already turned away, leaving no room for negotiation. In the days that followed, Thomas tried everything to restore their old relationship. He left another gift in her room. He had a book of poetry delivered. He tried to praise her work more than once in front of others, but it was all too late. and she finally saw clearly the pattern of manipulation hidden behind the courtesy. He didn't love her, he just loved to be admired. And when he realized that he was no longer the center of anything inside her, he was disconcerted, even childish. But June didn't let herself be touched. She was polite, grateful, and polite. But she didn't come back. Not even on the inside. She started saving her salary. She stopped buying treats for others, like she used to. She started taking online courses on her phone at night. A colleague helped her put together a short resume. June knew she didn't have anywhere to go yet, but she knew she couldn't stay any longer. And that was more than enough to make her take the first step. Because sometimes, leaving the place that belittles us is the only way to find our own height again. She no longer needed empty promises or sweet words spoken between phone calls to others. All she needed was peace. On the last Sunday before leaving the mansion, June woke up before the sun. The room was still dark, but inside her, everything was light. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel pain when breathing there. That space that had previously seemed like a cell of bottled feelings was now just a room with a bed, a window, and a door. She no longer cried when she woke up. She no longer dreamed of his presence in the kitchen. She didn't expect anything. And this lack of expectation was a new form of freedom. As she prepared her last breakfast in that house, she noticed that her gestures were firmer, as if she were cooking for herself, and in a way she was. It was the last coffee she made as a maid. It was the beginning of a woman who had finally chosen herself. Thomas appeared in the kitchen as he always did on Sundays, barefoot, with a book in his hand, a linen shirt open at the chest, and that casual manner of someone who believes the world revolves around him. He said good morning and complimented the smell of the coffee. She thanked him with a small smile. He pulled out the chair. She served the coffee without delay. When he said, "I'll miss your coffees," she simply replied, "You'll miss being served, Mr. Grayson. This is different." He looked at her, trying to decipher her tone. But it was too late. He no longer had the keys to her inner world. That afternoon, June packed her bags with the ease of someone closing a door to open windows. She carried a few clothes, 2 books, the now clean, flowery notebook, and a new courage that she herself still couldn't measure. At the gate, before leaving, she stopped for a moment and looked at the house, not with longing, but with the certainty that she had overcome something within herself. Behind her, Thomas appeared, as if running to stop something. He stopped close, without touching, with that look that once made her heart tremble. "June, I thought maybe you were exaggerating, but now, maybe I lost something important." She took a deep breath. She looked into his eyes calmly. "You didn't lose it. You never had it." "What I offered was mine, not yours. And now, it's mine back." June left without drama. She took the bus to a smaller town, where a distant cousin had offered her a room and a modest job as a caregiver for the elderly. It wasn't a mansion. There were no fancy furnishings, but there was peace, there was respect, and there was silence. Not the kind of silence that suffocates, but the kind that embraces, the kind of silence that heals. In her new job, she cared for a widow named Evelyn, who had been living alone since her husband died. Evelyn was sweet but tough. It took her a while to open up, but over time he saw in June a daughter he never had. And June, without realizing it, had come to care for this woman with a kind of love that asked for nothing in return. Sometimes he remembered Thomas, but like someone who remembers an old fever, with relief that it was over. It didn't hurt anymore. It didn't burn anymore. It just taught him, because pain, when embraced, becomes a path. And June, even without knowing it, was just beginning to walk hers. Time in that city seemed to pass more delicately. The days were simple, but full of beauties that June never had time to notice when she lived in silence inside the mansion. Now she woke up to the sound of birds and not to the noise of luxury cars at the gate. She prepared coffee for Evelyn with tenderness, without being observed by eyes that measured her usefulness. No one there expected more from her than respect and presence. And That for someone who lived years carrying other people's expectations was an almost sacred relief. Evelyn, in the beginning, treated everything as a formality, but June had a kindness that dripped from her gestures, and even without making an effort, she gradually won the heart of that lonely lady. As the months passed, the two developed a routine of complicity. Evelyn liked to read aloud, and June listened. June liked to walk in the late afternoon, and Evelyn would wait for her on the porch. With cold lemonade, they gradually exchanged confidences. The lady spoke of a love she had had and lost. June spoke little. She would only say that she had come from a place where she was not seen. Evelyn understood. Perhaps that was why, one afternoon, when June arrived tired from a doctor's appointment she had attended, she found a small box with a red bow on the bed. Inside, a pair of delicate earrings and a note. Every woman deserves something beautiful, just for existing. Evelyn didn't know the story, but she knew about the pain, and she recognized in June that gentle strength that only hurt women carry without making a fuss. Soon, June began to stand out in the community. She was always kind, always willing. She began to be invited to help in other homes, to help at charity events, and to read to children at the library. Wherever she went, she left an impression of strong delicacy, as if she were carrying a story without needing to tell it. And life, when it finds someone who walks with honesty, usually opens doors without making a fuss. It was at one of these events that June met Evelyn's niece, a young lawyer named Laura. The two became friends almost instantly. Laura was enchanted by the way June dealt with her aunt, with her care, with her presence. She said she had never seen the old lady so lively, and when she learned that June had a talent for organization and patience for details, he offered her a job managing a social project that she coordinated. June hesitated at first. She thought she couldn't do it, but Laura insisted. Evelyn supported her, and so little by little she put aside her apron to take on a new role. I still took care of the house, but now I also took care of spreadsheets, diaries, reports. She started studying at night and taking more advanced online courses. Her life, previously confined to the walls of a mansion where she was seen as a shadow, now expanded into spaces where she was light. And the most curious thing, she no longer sought approval, nor signs of love. She just walked. And that, in itself, was the greatest miracle. The reunion happened when she no longer expected anything. It was a charity gala, hosted by a local business group to raise funds. June had not intended to go, but Laura insisted that she go as a guest and representative of the social project. She lent her an elegant dress, discreet makeup, and shoes that seemed custom-made. When June looked in the mirror that night, she barely recognized herself. She was the same woman, but now inhabiting another body, the body of someone who had outlived herself. She entered the room silently, but did not go unnoticed. Her gaze, which had previously been averted from the eyes of others, was now steady. And it was this gaze that Thomas recognized first, even before he noticed her face. He was on the other side of the room, leaning against other men in ties, laughing at something that no longer seemed so funny. The years had not been kind to him. His tie was tight, his gaze a little lost, his smile more bitter than seductive. When his eyes met June's, there was a second of paralysis. He frowned, as if his mind did not immediately understand what her eyes saw, but she did not hesitate. She walked over to the table where the project representatives were sitting, smiled at the guests, shook hands, exchanged cards, and moved on, without even making a move to greet him. Thomas approached her an hour later, more uneasy than confident. He said her name softly, as if seeking a glimpse of familiarity. "June?" She turned slowly with a polite smile. "Mr. Grayson." He was silent for a few seconds, trying to understand what had happened. "You are different." She nodded. "Time does that, and so does pain." He swallowed hard, as if something bitter had caught in his throat. "I thought of you many times." She didn't react. She just raised her glass slightly and said, "I thought of myself. And that's what saved me." Thomas tried to make eye conversation. He wanted to know where she was living, what she was doing now. She responded with the same lightness with which one responds to a polite stranger. When he mentioned that he had faced some problems in business, that things had changed a lot since then, she simply nodded as if listening to the weather forecast. There was no sarcasm, no revenge, just the silence of someone who has nothing left to seek. And that silence weighed more than any shout. Before she left, she approached him. One last time. She looked into his eyes and said softly, "Thank you." He frowned, confused. "Why?" She smiled. "For teaching me what love is not. Without that, I would never have learned to truly love myself." And then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing amidst expensive lights and empty faces. It was as if the mansion, the garden, the mug with the letter J on it, had all come back to him at once, but now with no one to look at him with charm. And that absence, in that moment, was crueler than any abandonment. In the days following the event, Thomas returned home to a silence that even the walls were uncomfortable with. Nothing seemed different to the outside world, but inside him, there was something that no longer fit. The image of June walking through the hall with her head held high, the serenity on her face, the mature and calm tone of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. All of this repeated in his mind like a song he couldn't stop listening to. It wasn't longing. It was something else. It was a lack of importance. For the first time, he felt like he was no longer part of someone's memory. And for a man used to dominating rooms with his presence, being forgotten was the harshest punishment. He had lost someone he never acknowledged, and worse, she didn't even seem to carry any resentment, only indifference. And that corroded him. While Thomas brooded over the past, June moved forward. With her new position in the social project, she began to coordinate events, deal with influential people, and build bridges with other organizations. Her name began to be cited as a reference for silent leadership and emotional competence. She did not need to change her essence to grow. She simply found a place where her essence was finally recognized. Evelyn, now more fragile, followed everything with silent pride. She told the nurses that the girl who was now giving interviews was the same one who once served her soup with tears hidden in her eyes, and who still smiled. June reciprocated the affection with presence. She did not abandon her origins. He continued to visit Evelyn's house every day. It was like returning to the roots that kept her standing when everything seemed to be falling apart. An unexpected invitation arrived one morning. An international foundation wanted her to participate in a conference of women leaders who had overcome situations of emotional oppression and achieved professional success. She almost refused. She still didn't see herself as a leader. But Laura encouraged her. "You don't have to see yourself as great to be great. You already are." And so she went. She went on stage for the first time. She told her story without naming names. She spoke of a young woman who mistook attention for love, who waited to be chosen by someone who never had the courage to love. She spoke of the pain of silent deception, of the strength of starting over, and of how the greatest love of her life didn't come from outside, but was born the day she looked in the mirror and decided to save herself. The audience applauded, standing. Women cried, men stood up. She, moved, just smiled, not out of vanity, but out of gratitude, for having survived, for being reborn, and for finally being whole. That night, alone in the hotel room, she looked out the window at the sky and remembered the mansion's garden, the scent of the flowers she herself had planted to impress those who had never seen them. And she thought, some seeds bloom even after abandonment, because they were watered with sincere tears. She then closed her eyes and slept peacefully. The following months brought June a kind of peace she had never experienced before. It was not the peace of achievements, nor of visible rewards. It was the inner peace of someone who no longer owed anything to anyone, not even herself. She began to live lightly, without the constant need to prove that she was worthy of love, respect, or being noticed. This certainty was born silently, just as pain was born. But unlike pain, which burned, this certainty healed. Evelyn, increasingly fragile, became an even more sacred presence in her life. The two complemented each other, one at the end of her path, the other finally beginning hers. On a cold autumn afternoon, as the leaves danced in the backyard, Evelyn called June to her room. Holding her hand gently, she said simply, "You are the best thing that has ever come through here." And she closed her eyes forever. The old lady's death brought sadness, of course, but not despair, because Evelyn left in peace, and June was certain that she had done all she could. What she didn't expect was what came next. Days after the funeral, the family lawyer gave her a handwritten letter. It was a will. Evelyn had left her house, her savings, and a small plot of land in the country to June. With no children, no close nieces or nephews, she had chosen to give everything to the one person who, in her, "Words taught me that true caring cannot be bought," June cried, for the loss, for gratitude, for the confirmation that love doesn't need blood or labels, it only needs presence. With her inheritance, June decided to do something that she had kept close to her heart for a long time. She bought a modest house and turned it into a shelter for women in situations of emotional vulnerability. It was no ordinary shelter. It was a space for silence, for listening, for rebuilding. A place where no one was called the furniture of the house, where everyone had a name, a story, and value. The name of the place? Flor de Junio, in honor of the strength that blooms even after winter. Meanwhile, Thomas, now deep in debt and facing lawsuits for corporate misconduct, spent his days trying to salvage what was left of the empire he had built on appearances. Nothing was working anymore. His contacts avoided him. His wife was gone for good. His children barely spoke to him, alone in a house that had once been a symbol of prestige, now just dark and empty. He thought about June more often than he cared to admit. Sometimes I would sit on the porch and think I could hear soft footsteps coming from the kitchen, but it was just the echo of guilt. Because the true punishment for those who despise sincere hearts is to spend the rest of their lives surrounded by memories that don't respond. Thomas's days became long, drawn out, and bitter. He was no longer invited to events. His image had been tarnished by scandals and thoughtless actions. Little by little, people started to distance themselves, not out of fear of his downfall, but because they realized how false his brilliance was. He began to be remembered as a man who had everything but knew how to hold on to nothing. He lived isolated in the same mansion that had once been bustling with meetings, dinners, and admiring glances. Now the garden was neglected, the gate rusty, and the house was plunged into a silence unlike before. It was not the silence of calm but of absence, the absence of life, of care, of soul. He sat on the porch with a cold cup in his hands, staring into space, as if waiting for someone to appear from the past to save him from himself. Sometimes I thought about calling June, but I didn't have her number. I thought about writing, but what would I say? That I now understood her value, that I missed the coffees she served me with tenderness, that I regretted having called someone else my love, while she dreamed alone in silence. I knew that no letter could undo that, because the pain she felt couldn't be shouted, and the absence she left behind couldn't be filled with words either. He began to collect regrets, like he used to collect achievements. Only now, no one applauded him. Meanwhile, June was invited to speak in other cities. She became a reference for other women who, like her, confused love with attention, affection with control, affection with illusion. She never played the victim. She always told her story with the dignity of someone who had fallen but got up with her own hands. In an interview, when asked if she had ever been loved, she smiled and replied, "Today, yes, and by myself." The rest was a learning experience. It went viral. Thousands of women repeated the phrase, written in diaries on the walls of shelters, even in graffiti. June was not famous. She was an example, and that was enough. Her life was simple. She worked hard. She cried sometimes. She laughed often. She liked to cook in silence, to water plants, to walk barefoot at dusk. She didn't expect any more letters or apologies. She didn't want Thomas to suffer, only to learn. Because true forgiveness doesn't require presence. It just lets go. And she had let go. One day, as she walked through the yard of the shelter she had created, she saw a girl sitting alone. with a lost look in her eyes. She approached her slowly, sat down next to her, and said, "I know what it's like to love someone who forgets you even though they're right there with you. But I also know how beautiful it is when you start to remember yourself," the girl cried. And June held her hand, and there, without making a sound, another seed of healing was planted. Spring arrived with a sweet, calm wind in that city, where everything had begun again for June. The flowers in the Flor de Junio garden bloomed with the silent strength of those who had withstood many winters. It was a sunny Saturday, and the shelter was organizing a small fair to raise funds. There were homemade foods, crafts made by the residents, and soft music in the air. Among the visitors, a grey-haired man entered slowly, with uncertain steps and a hesitant look. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt, sunglasses, and carrying an envelope in his hands. June saw him from afar, recognized the way he walked before she even saw his face. Her heart didn't race, it didn't tremble. It just steadied itself, as if knowing that the moment of final settlement had arrived. Thomas stood before her, not knowing what to say. There were years in his eyes, years that time had weighed on him, years that silent guilt had chewed on him without rest. He took off his glasses, and his eyes were red, not from recent tears, but from nights that had not slept peacefully. He held out the envelope as if offering the most valuable thing he had. "It's just a letter," he said. "You don't have to read it now, or ever, but you had to give it to me." She took the envelope with both hands, looked into his eyes, and didn't see the man who had mistaken her for furniture. She saw only a broken man facing his own ruin. There was no victory there. There was no revenge. There was only destiny. And destiny, when it is fair, doesn't hurt. It only teaches. June put the envelope in her apron pocket. The fair continued around her, the laughter continued. The world did not stop for the pain that had once been deep. Thomas wanted to say something more, but she interrupted him gently. "You taught me that love cannot be begged for, and I have learned, thank you." There was no irony, there was no venom, only truth. He nodded, lowered his head, and walked away slowly, as if finally accepting that some doors, once closed, cannot be opened even with the most sincere apologies. That night, alone in her room, June opened the envelope. The letter was simple, blunt. It said he now understood what she meant, and that he wished he had been man enough to deserve her. It said he had lost everything, business, prestige, family, but the only loss that really weighed on him was her, not because of the love he thought she had, but because of the mirror she had offered him and which he had broken with contempt. At the end, she asked for forgiveness, and she said, "You were the only truth in a life full of embellishments." June closed the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it between the pages of the old flowery notebook, the same one he had given her, but which was now hers entirely. She sat down in the armchair next to the window, looked up at the sky and smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief, nor of pleasure in seeing the other pay for what they had done. It was the calm smile of someone who won without having to fight, of someone who had been forgotten and yet flourished, because karma isn't shouting, it isn't punishment, it's justice that arrives in the time of silence. And in that silence, June finally rested. If this story spoke to you in any way, click the like button to support our work, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that touch your soul deeply, and share in the comments. I too have been reborn in silence. I really want to read what you felt. And now, don't leave yet. The next video is already appearing on your screen. Click and come and be moved by another twist that will touch your heart.